Ehtasham joins me on the line now. Ehtasham, great to have you on the show. How did this happen so quickly?
Hi, thank you, Dan. Thanks for inviting me. I was also surprised. I wasn't expecting it will happen so swiftly. I think the petition I had set up as a sort of human rights campaigner rather than a councillor attracted a lot of attention, and we've got more than 5,000 signatures when I last checked in terms of the numbers. So I think.
And when did you set it up, Ehtasham?
It was probably Sunday, about 3 days ago, three or 4 days ago.
And was it sparked by the removal of the Colston statue in Bristol? Is that what prompted you to set the petition up?
That was definitely part of it. But before that, I think we were all having a collective reflection of our history and what's going on around the world, following on from George Floyd's murder, in terms of reconciliation with our past, race relations within the community.
Absolutely.
So all sorts of stuff's happening. And I thought to set up that petition and exercise a democratic process to have my say and see who all supported was the way forward, rather than resorting to, let's say, violent protest or removing it.
Which, by the way, I absolutely condemn you. I absolutely support you for that, rather than condemn. I support you for that. But how did it happen so quickly? That's what I'm interested in. You set up this petition, and 24 hours later, the Tower Hamlets Council have removed the Milligan statue, which obviously has stood since 1813. So was there any sort of process to get to that point, do you know?
So the Canal River Trust, who owns the land,
yes,
they started having conversation with the council and also the Docklands Museum or Museum of London, and to see what they're going to do. I wasn't expecting, to be honest with you, that it would be that quick. But am I pleased about it? Of course I'm pleased about it, because otherwise we would have probably attracted more protests where we would have wasted more resources, police presence and everything. So I'm rather pleased that it happened quickly.
But do you know who had to make the final decision?
I do not know who had to make the final decision. We had a statement from Canal River Trust. So I think it was a joint decision, a consensus between Canal River Trust, Tower Hamlets Council and the museum.
Well, you know, it backs up exactly what I said in my dispatch on this show yesterday. Organisations are going to be very open to hearing from people democratically at the moment. There is no need to physically, forcibly tear down statues. You've proven that you can make an impact, that you can have these bodies listen to you and actually overturn a statue that has stood for 200 years within 2 days. So congratulations on that, Ehtasham Haque, the Labour councillor for Blackwall and Covent Town in Tower Hamlets. Let me bring in now the historian Dominic Sandbrook, who has written a fascinating column about this whole issue for the Daily Mail. And Dominic, you're obviously very concerned about the fact that baying mobs can potentially just pull down a statue because they find it offensive.
Yeah.
However, at the same time, how do you feel about this democratic removal of the Milligan statue? Because it shocks me how quickly that has happened. And while clearly it's better than protesters going in and forcibly removing something, at the same time, you can't tell me that within 24 hours there can have been any sort of democratic process or debate taking place. Again, It feels like a very knee-jerk decision.
Yes, I'm sure there's probably an element of the council panicking a little bit and feeling that they had to act quickly because they hated the thought of there being any complaints or any protests or anything like that. I mean, I question that word democratic. If a group of activists put together a petition or indeed a march or whatever it might be, I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate way to engage with the political process, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the views of the majority. So you've seen opinion polls that show that although people were conflicted about the Colston statue in Bristol, the vast majority of people thought that tearing it down in that way was completely the wrong thing to do. So what I hate the thought of is sort of groups of very vociferous and often unrepresentative activists putting pressure on sort of timorous institutions to tear down elements of our national historical heritage. Of course, there are sort of conversations that you can have about these things, and you can contextualize them and all the rest of it. But once you've torn them down, they're gone, and you can't bring them back. So that statue in Bristol, which might have been the site where, people could have taken school children there to talk about slavery, to talk about Colston's role in Bristol and all the rest of it. Well, that's gone now. You can't do that. And I think once you've torn these things down, a society that sort of has groups of activists roaming the land to find statues of people they find objectionable and ripping them down, that's not a society that is in a good or a healthy place, I think.
No. At the same time, however, you have a lot of people saying it's just simply going to be untenable to have any statues up of anyone with any connection to the slave trade whatsoever. What's your position on that?
Well, I think that's, frankly, an absurd position to take. If you take everybody, think of it this way, Dan. Take everybody who's now dead, so everybody who's ever lived. Almost all of them have attitudes that we would now consider objectionable, just as we have attitudes that we take for granted that our successors will find unpleasant. So to give you an example, somebody pointed out that in 300 years' time, people may look at Nelson Mandela and say, "My God, the man ate meat. He was a criminal. How could they?" And so on and so forth. I think that's a bad position to be in. I think a much more reasoned and humble position to take towards our predecessors is to see them as rounded human beings, rather than to say, they were involved in the slave trade, they didn't like homosexuality, they were not supporters of feminism. They held all these views that we now consider wrong. Therefore, we should rip them down and erase them from our national landscape. I think that's completely the wrong way to do it.
So what do you think the solution is? Contextualising these people, adding plaques perhaps that explain more about maybe their role in some unsavoury aspects of history?
You can do that, of course. One easy way to solve it, I think, is actually put up more statues. So, you could actually have more figures represented rather than fewer. Most of us quite like statues and quite like public art of various kinds. So I don't think there's any problem with doing that. I think that putting up plaques is a very good way of providing a little bit of context. But I think this sort of, let's blow things up and rip them down, just that doesn't sit well with me as a historian, as somebody who values the past. And, traces of the past are so important to us and important to our children, to educate them about where we've come from and all the rest of it. And the idea that by ripping away layers, you'll get to a better understanding of our past, I think is completely bonkers.
And of course, The Spectator pointing out today, what about the Fawcett statue that Sadiq Khan erected in 2018? He set up this Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. Well, actually, if you look into the history of Fawcett, who is obviously celebrated for the campaign for women's suffrage, she was also commissioned in 1901 by the government to lead an investigation into British concentration camps in South Africa during the Second Boer War, and apparently said they're a pretty good thing. We need them as part of the war effort.
Now, that doesn't prove, this is the interesting thing, that doesn't prove that she was a villain. What that just proves is that everybody in the past had what we would now consider skeletons in their closet, because they were human beings with flaws and weaknesses. That's true of Churchill, it's true of Nelson, it's true of even people who you might think are saintly figures, Emmeline Pankhurst or somebody, sort of the early feminists. They all had views that we now look at and they say, oh my God, I can't believe they would think that, how terrible, how racist, all the rest of it. But that's just the nature of the human condition. This idea that we are uniquely virtuous and we can look at all our predecessors and sort of, we can identify the sin and we can root it out and tear them down and all the rest of it. I find that so unsettling.
No, I completely agree. Dominic Sandbrook, thank you so much